Wake up, Tenno.
Welcome back, Tenno. Today we've got one of those guides that I don't too often, a build guide. But also because this was an opportunity to touch on something that is so little known in the community that a streamer tried to call me out to tell me I had no idea what I was talking about. We're going to take a look at our newest addition to the arsenal today, Xaku Prime. Rather than giving the rinse and repeat, stack it full of strength and turret mode with Grasp of Loke that seems to be what several creators have spit out, I wanted to make this something you'd actually use and not go, well, this starts to suck as soon as enemy levels start climbing. So we're going to instead take advantage of an interaction between Xata's Whisper and AoE abilities. But we'll get into that in a moment. Keep in mind that on the occasions I do build videos, my point here is to give you a framework and explain how it works so you can customize it to fit your playstyle. Prime mods can be swapped to normal ones, shards can be adjusted to normal shards, or you may decide you want more range than me and swap over extended in there somewhere. If you've got suggestions, let us all know in the comments, and while you're down there, help the channel out by hitting those like and subscribe buttons so the algorithm shows it to more people. Anyway, first let's look at Xaku like you've never seen it before, and what its base kit does. Xaku's passive is probably the most passive I can think of. Straight reduction to AoE damage and what equates to dodge chance. Much like Komei's third ability, however, this is just a chance to prevent damage and cannot be relied upon as the sole source of survivability. Works until it doesn't, at which point, if you have no other defense system, you get deleted. Xaku's first ability is called Xata's Whisper. This ability has a ton of confusion around it as far as the mechanics of how damage is applied, so let's try and simplify this as best as we can. Each bullet, grenade, projectile, laser beam, or any other kind of weapon damage instance created by your weapon while this buff is active carries along an additional instance of damage as void damage relevant to your strength stat. A shot from a Bratton Prime that does 100 damage total is fired while the buff is active for a 50% bonus will deal the 100 damage plus a separate instance of 50 damage as void damage. This works in basically the same method as Saren's Toxic Lash, but with void damage instead of toxin. Now keep in mind that this kind of ability, triggered off damage instances, applies a separate instance per damage instance. That's a lot of instances. This means multi-shot, AoE explosions, and the like can trigger individual instances of Xata's Whisper. Xata's also double dips on faction damage mods. For example, if you do 100 base damage with a 60% heat bonus for 160 damage from your weapon, and have a primed Bane faction multiplier on your weapon, that 160 damage gets the final multiplier of 1.55 applied for a total of 248 damage on its own. If you also have Xata's buffed at say 50%, then that same shot will apply 2 instances of damage. One at 248 as your weapon's IPS and element breakdown, and it will do an additional instance of damage at 124 as void damage that also gets multiplied with a faction mod of 1.55 for a total second instance of 192.2 damage as void. As if that wasn't complicated enough, there are some extra things you should know about Xata's Whisper. 1. It deals solely void damage, which means it will not reapply other status effects on its own. That was a thing for a short while with the glitchy interaction between Toxic Lash and Xata's, and they rightly patched that sometime back. 2. When the void status is applied to an enemy, it creates an attractor bubble similar to mags around the enemy, and all shots coming at the enemy will redirect and hit the spot that was hit to inflict the void status. This means headshots will redirect to headshots and will be more important if using a weapon where headshots are required. It also means things like filling up an incarnate meter can be done much more efficiently on landing an initial headshot, especially on weapons like shotguns that tend to spread pellets around. It can also lead to an issue sometimes with explosions from such weapons where the splash damage will trigger a void status and attract shots to somewhere else. For this reason, you generally need to classify your weapon selection as either explosive AoE or precision weapons, as you will have a hard time making both work due to the nature of the ability. Okay, we can finally move on from Xaku's first ability. Its second ability, yes, Xaku is a Frankenstein of 3 warframes and is an it, is called Grasp of Loke. This ability uses void energy to yoink all the weapons from enemies within your radius and turns these weapons into void weapons that float around Xaku while staggering the enemies and forcing them to resort to melee attacks against you. The damage these weapons deal is scaled off both your strength stat and enemy levels, so this ability can scale decently into higher end content. But the number of weapons this creates is based off your range, so push strength and range for a turret build and you don't need a video on how to push 2. This ability does not require line of sight to steal weapons, but does need it for the weapons to shoot at something. And the ability cannot be recast while your maximum weapons are floating around you. For today's build, we're actually going to subsume over Grasp of Loke with an ability I never thought I'd put on a frame, but bear with me, Komei's Omamori. You can replace either Xaku's 2 or 3 with this, and realistically, you can replace Omamori with the defensive helmet of your choice. Arguably even putting something like Pillage on in order to armor strip and provide a little defense. But realistically, with what we're doing, we don't even need armor strip. So I opted to replace Xaku's 2, so its 3 can still armor strip if I stay in a mission for several hours and things start to get a little tanky. Xaku's third ability is called The Lost, and is a multi-part ability. By default, tapping the button will rotate between which function you want to use, and holding it will cast the selected function. If you want to swap that, go into your menu under Invert Tap Hold Abilities, and you can change the function for Xaku's abilities. The 3 parts of The Lost are Accuse, Gaze, and Deny. Accuse creates a void fissure and causes enemies within range to turn on their allies and fight for you. Gaze is Xaku's armor strip ability and entangles an enemy with void tendrils and makes them invulnerable while entangled and strips the armor and shields of enemies within range. Gaze fully strips at 200% strength, and if you use corrosive projection, only 164% strength is needed for a full strip. The last of the Lost's options is called Deny. Deny shoots a beam of energy that scales off strength, the number of floating weapons that you have from Xaku's second ability, and the void invulnerability from Xaku's fourth ability that we'll talk about in a moment. Deny does a large chunk of damage and suspends enemies hit in the air for a significant amount of time. Certain builds can go for this being the main damage dealer, but the tendency is for people to leave the Lost set on Gaze for armor stripping. Xaku's fourth ability is called the Vast on Time. Xaku blows itself up and explodes in void energy, doing damage to things around it and inflicting a 50% void damage vulnerability on anything hit by the explosion. This leaves Xaku in its skeletal form, which seems like it would make Xaku weaker, but in fact it buffs its passive dodge bonus up to 75%, it increases movement speed by 20%, and pauses the timer on all Xaku's other abilities while active. This of course can be abused, as you will want to spend most of your time in skeletal form for obvious defensive reasons, and this will keep Xaku's other abilities on an almost endless pause while you are in skeletal form. And note here that it will not pause the timers on Helminth abilities such as Roar or Nourish you may have put onto Xaku, but only Xaku's original abilities. The vulnerability from this ability of course directly synergizes with Xaku's first 3 abilities, meaning additional hits from Xata's Whisper, beams from Deny, or shots from the stolen weapons from Grasp of Loke will do additional damage to enemies affected by Vast on Time. In short, not only always keep your 4 up for defense, but recast it frequently to debuff your enemies. Okay, now that we've had our overview, you can already see that there's a lot of ways to build Xaku. The most common is, as I mentioned, to stack strength and range and become a living turret, and that's what you'll see most of the time when you search for builds. So I wanted to give you good to know something different, as well as use this as an opportunity to teach about a synergy that exists with Xata's Whisper, Blast. To explain this synergy, we have to look at how the damage is applied. With Xata's Whisper activated, you shoot an enemy and it does the total damage of your shot after multipliers, then Xata's triggers and does a percentage of that damage as a second hit. First, every multi-shot bullet you fire will do its own proc of Xata's. Second, Xata's will double dip on faction modifiers and elementalist mods in Roar, so final multipliers. Now, if we look at the elements that leave status effects, we triple dip on those final damage multipliers, as it applies to the initial damage dealt, the damage over time, and the Xata's secondary hit. If we look at Blast, however, it adds an additional explosion as its status damage, at which point the Blast explosion also triggers Xata's. So initial hit, status damage explosion, already we're double dipping. Then on the Blast explosion, a Xata's bubble is procced, which is multiplied again by faction damage, thus triple dipping on any Blast and Xata weapon setup. Now, if we want to make this absolutely nuts, which of course we're going to do, you spread the Blast procs via melee influence, which on its own will proc Xata damage, Blast explosions, and Xata damage, thus quadruple dipping on influence Blast explosions. Credit where credit is due, this seems to have first been reported by Dystopia, and I'll leave the links for his and Aznvasion's videos on the subject in the comments. But this is the interaction we're going to exploit on Xaku, because Xaku already has Xata's on it. Now, before we do anything, I'm going to point at the shards I have equipped. These are mostly fluid, but I'm running 3 purple Tau shards for melee crit damage that are doubled by having over 500 maximum energy, 1 Tau yellow for casting speed, and 1 Tau yellow for additional energy from energy orbs to help with my energy economy. Let's start with the melee weapon we're going to use to proc all of this before we look at Xaku himself. We're going to use the basic Zorus build because 1, everyone gains access to this pretty early on, and 2, because it force procs electric on the heavy explosion, which helps us spread melee influence. The stance doesn't really matter here, since we aren't going to be swinging the glaive around like it's a sword, so whatever you have, either Astral Twilight or Gleaming Talon will work. The most important thing on here, start out with, is Galvanized Reflex, the new Galvanized mod purchased with Vitus Essence from the Arbitrations vendor. If you don't have this, Corrupt Charge would be the budget-friendly option, but as you can tell, there would be a decent-sized gap in the initial combo and thus total damage. Since we know we're going to be sitting at least a 5 times combo multiplier, that allows us to use Weeping Wounds to help Zorus' pretty lackluster status chance so we can more reliably proc Blast through our influence spread. Now that we have the status chance, we obviously need to put Blast on here, so we'll use North Wind and Molten Impact. For crit, we're going to run Sacrificial Steel, since Galvanized Steel just wouldn't be enough crit for us with Zorus' base crit chance. Crit damage, we're running Amalgam Organ Shatter, because it takes forever to wind up and throw glaives. We're going to run our faction damage, so we can do that whole quadruple dip thing. Volatile Quick Return is on here to increase our blast radius, but can also be swapped out for based Elementalist mods to boost damage output and reduce the wind-up speed at the cost of overall damage spread. As an arcane, of course, we're running Melee Influence, and Dispatch Overdrive is in our Exilus just because I had some extra capacity due to the amount of format I put in here, but realistically you can skip format and skip an Exilus mod altogether. If you have a Riven, the more advanced version of this build will swap your Riven in for whatever it has on it that's already in your build. Mine isn't a great Riven by any means, but it has heat on it, so I'll swap it in for the heat mod, and since it has some extra crit, it would make up for the difference between Sacrificial Steel, so I'll drop that, and for more crit damage, then I'll roll with it for now. You probably noticed there's no base damage on this Zorus build, so we'll hop over to Xaku's frame next, where we have Arcane Fury to provide base damage to the Zorus. We're also going to run Ready Steel as an aura, so we can maintain a 6 times combo multiplier between our heavy explosions on the Zorus. As far as the rest of Xaku, anything you see here that's primed or umbral, don't worry, you can still run the non-primed or the Archon versions for a more budget-friendly version at the cost of some effectiveness. For a strength boost to our Xata damage, we're going to run Umbral Intensify and Blind Rage. To compensate for our now tank deficiency, we will crank up our duration with Prime Continuity, which means our Vastan time will stay up and effectively increase the duration of our other abilities for almost 39 seconds at a time. To double dip helping both our energy economy and triggering the purple shards we're going to run, we've got Prime Flow in here. If you don't have Prime Flow or Archon Flow, normal flow on its own won't put you up over 500 energy for purple shards, so do keep that in mind. For defense, we've got a weird amalgamation of shield tanking and dodging going on from multiple layers of defense. We're running Primed Redirection here to give us a decent shield pool of 988. Plus Carnus Carapace and Gladiator Resolve to buff our health pool up to 574. Gladiator Resolve obviously provides an additional 60% additive crit on our Zorus, but Carnus Carapace is part of where things get odd, giving us an additional protection and status immunity after heavy attack kills, which given that this is solely a heavy attack glaive build, is all our kills. Should something with 20% reduced accuracy also somehow make it past our 50% chance of Omamori triggering and our 75% dodge chance from Vastan time, we're running Arcane Aegis to give us a chance of regenerating shields and becoming basically invulnerable for 12 seconds. And then we've got additional on our companion that I'll touch on in a bit. Obviously fates can align, but for the most part, we're pretty tanky. The last mods we've got on our frame are Vigorous Swap, for a large damage boost to our Zorus because of it being treated like Power Throw and applying multiplicatively to glaive throws and explosions. And of course, Prime Sure-Footed because spending less time on your butt is... Nah, I'm kidding. Ideally, yes, PSF is what I would run here, but it's not going to make or break the build so much as just a quality of life thing. If you don't have it, you could run pretty much whatever you want in this spot, ranging from Handspring to normal Sure-Footed to a drift mod such as Power Drift for more strength. Honestly, if you don't want or have PSF in there, it's a flex spot. So on to the companion. What Xaku's primary issue is that it's squishier than a microwave marshmallow. So we need something to keep us up, yet another line of defense, but we also want something to help us kill things faster because dead things can't kill us. Worm would be redundant because we already have effective status immunity from the Karnas set. So our options are really either Diriga to prime and use Guardian, Shield Charger, and Sacrifice along with Manifold Bond to keep those abilities moving, but Diriga loses some effectiveness having to use either the Volcax or Volclock in order to trigger Tenacious Bond. I'll post the build I use for that here, and the Volcax here, but for this build generally I opt to run the Panzer Vulpaphyla, which is what we're going to go over here. On our Panzer, for abilities we're going to run all 3 ability mods. Viral Quills, so he can spread viral like crazy. Martyr Symbiosis, so he will sacrifice himself to save Xaku should everything hit the fan. And Panzer De-Evolution to turn that sacrifice into something that doesn't really affect us at all, because he will continue to spread viral even while he's down. To keep him from going down when we don't want him to, we're running Link Redirection, as it provides the best defense bonus for a single mod slot for him by using the shield capacity on our frame. And we're running Prime Pack Leader, which I somehow just noticed isn't even maxed out on this build, but goes to prove the point that we're going to be getting a lot of melee hits, and this Overguard will max out almost immediately. We will essentially Overguard gate for him by our normal gameplay loop. Onto the utility we have on him, we're running Fetch for the obvious reasons that we don't hate ourselves, then Tenacious Bond to get that sweet crit damage bonus. We're running Tandem Bond, less for the companion building our combo since we'll be resetting the combo every throw, but more for our heavy attacks boosting his damage by 180% due to our 6 times initial combo multiplier. We'll couple that with Hunter Recovery to convert our companion's damage into some giant heals, then we'll even use Duplex Bond to make our companion multiply and go kill more things, since with 155 casting cost, we'll spawn a clone every time we cast Fast on Time. The claws themselves, we're running a core setup with 60/60 mods, either for Corrosive Cold or for Viral Electric depending on the faction we're facing. But Viral Electric is the general safe bet as we already have armor stripping on our frame if we need it, so we're running Frostjaw, Venom Teeth, and Shot Collar here for elements. The rest of this is all pretty standard. Mod selection for claws isn't exactly massive at the moment, so we've got Bite, which you only need to get around rank 3 or 4 in order to get 50% crit for Tenacious Bond, but here it's at max because pet damage is half decent now. We're running Precision Conditioning to convert our base damage that was already slash to slash with a 385% bonus. Maul for a base 330% bonus, and Call the Weak because pet CO, even though we won't get the 240% bonus as all our attacks are going to be crits here. If your bite isn't maxed, you'll pull an extra raw damage out of this. We're running Assassin Posture to prioritize taking out HVTs and giving our companion additional damage against their Overguard. So that covers the core loadout, but leaves open our primary and secondary weapons to be pretty much whatever you want. I'm running dual Tox on a Blast setup because Blast Xata, but the thing I'll point out here is that I dropped a mod to add in Karnas Stinger, and that's where I'm getting the extra tier of the Karnas set bonus. I'm not going to go over what I've got on here because you can absolutely run whatever you want with one stipulation. It has to be a weapon that does not split wield with glaives. For example, the Epitaph, when you switch to it, also pulls out the Zorus. We don't want that. Compare that to the dual Tox, which when we swap it out does not pull out the Zorus, and that's what we do want, because that's how we will easily proc our Vigorous swap without going insane. Tap weapon swap, hold melee to throw, tap weapon swap, hold throw, repeat. As long as your secondary weapon isn't pulling out the Zorus on its own, holding your melee to throw it while your secondary is equipped will have technically swapped to the Zorus and thus trigger Vigorous swap. Your primary can also be whatever you want. I opted for the Miter as a utility weapon to knock out nullifier shields just because they annoy me. Mine is running Corrosive with an Incarnate adapter on. Your exact build doesn't matter much, so long as you've got Neutralizing Justice on here to insta-pop nullifier bubbles. There's nothing extraordinary about it. Miter's pretty basic, running the normal Galvanized Chamber, Amalgam Serration for the sprint speed, Shred because I couldn't fit Prime Shred, Infected Clip and Stormbringer for corrosive damage, crit delay for crit, We've already talked about neutralizing justice and terminal velocity for projectile speed. My particular Riven has crit damage, multi-shot, and projectile speed. Merciless is in the arcane slot, mostly for reload speed, as I rarely kill things with this. But if I did, they'd likely die to slash, so Merciless is better. For those who have the Incarnate form and care, I'm running Swift Sawblades, Swift Deliverance, and Commodore's Fortune as the evolutions. But again, this weapon slot can be whatever you want, and I just found the Miter to be my personal preference for its utility. 99.9% of Xaku's kills on this build will be from melee and damage over time. So on that note, let's look at the gameplay loop and how to do this. We'll hit Omomori on R2 and keep re-upping that every time it runs low. Hit Xata's Whisper, then hit Vast Untime to max our defensive ability and pause the timer on Xata's. Find a group of enemies, throw Zorus, and heavy detonate. After the first group is down, it should only take one hit of the heavy explosion for the next several hundreds of levels. Keep hitting Vast Untime to keep Xata's paused and debuff nearby enemies. If you decide to set up camp somewhere in a survival or defense, you can drop your gaze ability on an enemy to give you big dopamine numbers. But as you can see, there are so many procs for such large amounts, it doesn't even matter. If you're in something where levels get large enough that they're just not instantly evaporating with the initial hit, Xata's procs, blast explosions, and influence damage, then you can use Vast Untime to debuff them and drop gaze for armor stripping. Overall, not a complicated build to run, but certainly more active than the usual stand in place and watch void turrets shoot things. That's going to wrap up this one. I hope this gives you an alternative to wreck things in a non-turret mode with a little more active play style if that's what you enjoy. I'll catch you all on the next one. Happy hunting, Tenno.